And while I was sharpening, I was looking at the drawing, of course, looking for any nudges we can make. I think we're lacking a little bit of tone on this lower area of the glute, sort of just had a sort of even tone around here. Let's just push it a little bit darker to have it turn more. Alright, let's keep going with this area over here. Softening this transition a little bit towards the darker tone. So first I push it a little bit back, and then, you know, I can hatch in a little bit of some intermediate tone. Alright, just wanted to soften these creases a little bit so they look less like lines and more like parts of the form. So I'm just kind of trying to figure out this area here. Because it gets a little bit lighter towards the top this plane, and then maybe it just turns a little more sharply towards the right there. And perhaps this tone is a little bit too dark over here overall. It's still the light part of the big four modeling. We just want it to turn. Alright, we can start heading down towards the legs now. Just trying to tackle these small light lines that I see going on here. Again, I have to be a bit mindful about my memory card, so just looking back every now and then to see how much time I have left before my camera stops recording. Kind of happy with this area now. I left it overall a little bit too light initially. I think probably the same applies here. I'll just have to darken things a little bit, but I'll sort of do that while I'm smoothing things out a little bit. So probably I'll just first start by darkening out the center a little bit. So this kind of tricky thing going on where we can see from the knee on, there is a sort of separation between the muscles in the back of the thigh. It creates this sort of very subtle plane in here that we want to describe, but we don't want to overplay the value shift too much. I initially made this whole edge a little darker, but it was too much. It would have worked, but I wasn't really happy with it. can barely see what I'm doing myself, so. I imagine it's not gonna be too great to watch this, but we'll see if I can see it on the camera. So perhaps before we head more into the center, we wanna just actually render this. Perhaps I can even switch back to the HB for a moment here. Get a bit more of that turning tone a little bit more easily. All right, let's continue with the leg. So I feel I pushed this side a little bit too dark, so I just have to kind of roughly lighten it up a little bit overall, and then perhaps we can search for those forms again. Because this side was pretty much equally dark as the left side, which is the shadow side. The tones on that side will be quite a bit darker than the tones on this side if we want to create a realistic looking form. The situation where these tones would appear sort of equal would be if the light was coming from straight on, and in that case of course the turning tones would be probably lighter overall, since we wouldn't even see the shadow. Just trying to gently push this over a little bit. I'm doing it, gently because, of course, I don't want to create a mess for me to clean up afterwards. There's always a little bit, but we can just be very slow and gradual about it if we want to retain that kind of softness we want for a finish in this stage. I just tackled some distracting bits over there in the shadow, which I shouldn't do, but that is the next stage. So this knee area is taking a little bit more time because it's a bit complex. It has a form coming from the shadow, then ending in another somewhat darker crease, then the fatty pad creating another form, ending in a final form. So we have to sort of manage that in terms with the big form modeling, sort of having a darker area, middle area. The middle area having highlight also kind of makes things a little bit trickier to manage, and then we have the final light side turning, which feels quite light, but we need to darken it a little bit to make the form turn and sort of have the three-dimensional effect here. But I think it's working pretty well now. It's feeling somewhat subtle. Perhaps it'll, improve a little bit as well when we move further down, which we will do now. You can always come back and dot pick a little bit if we find some unsatisfying things happening in the transition areas, but yeah, let's move along. Perhaps we want to reinforce the bedbug line here a little bit. It's a little bit lost. When on the picture it's quite clear, it's definite. Does define this kind of turning at the form quite nicely. It's actually very, very clear. So let's just make it very clear on here. We don't want it sharp, but we want to define it, and then we work the transition again. Also, I think to note it is quite dark, honestly. Perhaps we can play that up a little bit even here, so that we can retain a little bit of, you know, range for the reflected lights as well. Of course, the goal is to tackle this sort of stuff in the variations of the dark stage, but you know, we're humans. We might need to come back in another session to realize what we need to do. We can't always, you know, be perfect, so we have to work a little bit, you know, in between the stages. But let's remember that the stages exist in order to create a sort of structure and roadmap for this stuff, as opposed to, you know, being a very rigid sort of limiting thing. We want it to be something that's actually helpful to us, which it is. For a student, it gives a pretty good, you know, starting point for things. But of course, we're allowed to, you know, to fix things, but we don't want to hop around too much. So I'm not really encouraging you to be careless with this process, but take your time and really try to make sure that you got all the things covered in the stages. But of course, you know, as your eye develops, even during one project like this, it already like gets a little bit better at spotting mistakes. As your eye develops, you know, you might find things you did wrong in the previous stages only once you sort of proceed with the project, so it's normal. It's normal. So I'm just, maybe I'll leave alone the foot area for now. We'll tackle this area a little bit later. Let's maybe make a little note of how dark we want to go with this bedbug line over here. I want to go quite dark actually. And now it's looking a little bit better. I feel like the form is working already a little bit more, even just with reinforcing the bedbug line and then having a slight tone next to it. What I did was I just made the bedbug line a little bit darker, a little bit, you know, more cohesive, let's say more well drawn initially, and then I just softened the edge a little bit with a darker turning tone. And from there it starts turning towards this kind of maybe flatter plane as well in the calf area. Okay, let's keep working. So what you saw me do there just now was I felt like I had to go in and lighten the outline a little bit. I feel like it just pops out a little bit too much if it's not necessary to have a very dark turning tone on the light side of the form. And then we suddenly get very dark with the outline. It sort of creates a bit of distraction, sort of pulls us away from realism and into the realm of sort of stylized drawings. In places we can use those lines as accents and this kind of stuff, and that will create a nice effect. But if it's like happening in many places, then just kind of is a bit distracting, let's say. It can look nice, but not sort of accidentally as a remnant of the previous stages. So I'm not saying you shouldn't use dark outlines, it's not that case, but it's something that I would use sparingly in the lighter areas. Then I just went ahead and fixed a little bit of the impression on the right calf over there, which sort of suffered a little bit from this erasing procedure. So, all right, I think that's looking a little bit better. I just wanted to sort of roughly fix that area with, fix that outline before we go further into the rendering. We will probably further refine this with the other calf being there, but we don't really want to get stuck on the other calf when this is the area we're working on. So I think what we're lacking here a little bit is the sort of tone that defines the roundness also of the calf muscles in this sort of three-dimensional way. We can imagine it's a sort of, I don't know, a balloon kind of structure. It sort of rounds down towards itself as well. It's not just, flat from here to here. You can see there's a little bit of tone before it starts turning into the Achilles tendon there. So we could have maybe added something like this already in the plane stage, but also it's quite a subtle thing, so these subtleties are often best left for rendering, because the more subtle a thing is, the likelier it is that your tool kind of misses the mark when you apply the graphite. So regardless, you will have to just, erase a lot, or fix the shape a lot, or fix the tone a lot, otherwise, darkening, lightening. So it's not like the stump, for example, in this case would save us a whole lot of trouble from this hatching, which we're now sort of having to do. And it's not a lot that we have to do here. We're almost already there, but we just perhaps want to darken this side a little bit. Since we don't want to go overboard with this either. It's not like it's a huge shift from a round thing to a straight Achilles tendon there. It's a very sort of flowing transition there. I think that's almost enough already. And don't worry if you don't see these things initially, it's a pretty subtle thing. Your eye will get better, of course, at seeing different tones. And knowing the anatomy, of course, helps there as well. Knowing what's actually happening with the forms, if you can't see it in your reference, is always helpful. Now I have a little dark line sort of thing going on here, so let's just pick it out a little bit, at least in the center, so it doesn't distract us too much. Perhaps a little bit more tone on this side here. Probably the way I'll be working here is I'll just sort of pass through this figure once, and then before I sort of wrap things up, I think I'll just work on a couple of things more once we, get the shadows rendered and everything. So I'll just give it a little once over and adjust anything that bothers me or where I see some things to be fixed. But yeah, first let's just work through the whole image. So yeah, I'm just trying to work more, talk less at this point so I can finish this drawing. And of course, since I'm speeding up these places where I don't talk, that will speed up your viewing experience as well. I'm just trying to be a bit more conscious of your time instead of rambling all the time. So. All right, I think I'm calling it on this left lower limb. And a little bit of explanation perhaps here is something we can do in this foot area. As you know, I left it a little bit darker at the start. I could still create a bit more contrast here by first remaining dark in the halftones and the shadows. And yeah, we don't really need too much of those, you know, very light lights to describe form, because I really wanted to sort of underplay these values compared to anything above it. When I come back to this area, perhaps I'll adjust maybe some shapes, you know, look at transitions, stuff like this. For one, I can see a little bit of a lost shadow articulation in this case, where the fibula's shadow is a little bit, well, it's just the wrong shape, so let's just work that in there a little bit more. But yeah, overall this area feels, you know, all right, I feel, in contrast to the areas above it, you know. And we try to maintain the hierarchy, sort of darker to lighter to even lighter to lightest, basically. Perhaps this area is equally light to this area, but also there's not that much distance between these two areas either. Maybe we can address even further the hierarchy when we make some adjustments on this pass, but yeah, might work a little bit more here, might fix some shapes. For instance, this shadow shape I already took a look at here, but want to perhaps push this a little bit further towards the top side of things, so we get a bit of separation between this gastrocnemius, or sorry, the calf muscles and the tendon, versus the shadow that's cast on basically the fibula over here, or the peroneal muscles might be as well. Probably the fibula doesn't really, unless she's very bony in that part, then perhaps it's the fibula, but who knows. Anyways, we adjust that thing, but yeah, we'll come back to these things later. We still only have this area to render on the figure. After that, we'll just look at some things in the lights and then finally move to the shadows or darks. All right, let's look at this right leg, so we can then wrap up the lights, or rather look at some final things before we wrap up the lights. this is one of those areas where we need to fix a lot of things because the tools we like using, the stump and the stubby brush, they aren't so exact or accurate that we could really match these smaller things happening here. We used the pencil a little bit, but we still didn't really aim for a super precise finish. So here I pushed down the value of this highlight a little bit. It's now slightly darker than this one. Maybe it will push the other heel a little bit back, but it's still, you know, the information remains. I'm just cleaning up this right foot area a little bit because I felt it was, you know, a little bit behind the other areas in terms of, you know, cleanness. So, you know, looking at the whole thing. Of course, after one goes through a whole figure like this, you know, being very picky and meticulous about the cleanness of tone and the transitions and everything, once you reach this point, then you look up and you will see that, you know, probably the you know, the quality of work might have gone up a little bit as you warm up and start paying more attention to smaller things further down below. So just go over to the top and, you know, fix anything that really bothers us, but it's not the plan to, you know, take another whole pass along this. Just tackle some things we missed perhaps in the first passes. Also, as you can see, I'm battling the sun a little bit with my studio here. I hope this doesn't really mess up the contrast too much, but yeah, you'll see my hand probably cast a little bit more shadow than usual because the window light is so bright. All right, let's take a look at a few things here. Just feel this right side of the knees a little bit too light, so I'm just gonna sort of lightly color in that area. See, it was pretty much paper white over there, even though it's a little bit lighter than the surrounding tones, but don't really maybe want it to be that light. But it's getting to the point where it's, you know, hard to actually differentiate the tones well enough, so just leave it at that now. All right, one thing I spotted earlier was that this was feeling a little bit too sharp, so let's just soften it a little bit, perhaps towards the bottom, because that's the sharper feeling edge. So I feel like we could have made these a little bit darker as well, but I think they work as they are. So maybe let's just work a little bit of tone in there. Just try to work it in there in a soft way, so we don't, have to re-render everything. We don't have to make it super soft, we just want to make it softer than a line, basically, because this is a pretty sharp crease. We just don't want it to look like a line when you look at it. Again, maybe I feel like the hand needs a little bit more, perhaps refinement in terms of just kind of dot picking. Just make it look a little bit cleaner, since it does kind of draw a little bit of attention. I'm doing this just by coloring in basically inconsistencies and picking out any dots that are distracting. Perhaps I can add just a hair of softness to this edge over here. It's kind of, again, a very sharp thing going on here, since there's a super dark area and then there's a super light area. So let's just go over the edge and give it some softness at least. There is a lot of contrast, it will appear sharp, but let's at least make our best effort to make that a little bit more natural feeling. It's more so about the feeling that we're creating rather than what we see in the photo, I think. Something looks sharp on the photo, rule of thumb is we're not going to make it that sharp. So I'm basically trying to tackle anything that feels very sharp, Perhaps we can even pick out a little bit of this sharpest dark tone over here to just soften things a little bit. It's really not serving any purpose here, having it be extremely dark and attention grabbing. I know it's pretty dark on the picture again, but having a dark line there just really doesn't serve the form, and also it just grabs attention in the wrong way. You might be thinking this is already a pretty, micro level of detail, but that's how you can really refine these graphite drawings to the next level. I mean, I don't really think it's, the best and only way to work even. I think it's, I think it's a good way to sort of learn to really zoom in and look at the small things as well, pay attention to details. I'm not saying it's probably the best way to work, dot picking like this. It's very, very time consuming, that's for sure. Yeah, so on the picture we can see all kinds of stuff happening, separations between the bones of the hand and all this kind of stuff. So we can try to indicate a little bit of that, but it's also, a place where we can, start getting the feeling that we just have detail for the sake of detail, Probably adding this darker mark to suggest the separation of the fingers doesn't really add too much, but yeah, we could pull it off there, so let's just leave it very subtle like that. But if we want to really accurately describe everything we see on the photo here, it's just something we probably can't do very well unless we painstakingly start coloring in dots value by value, because I mean, look at the size of this area. We want to put like 3 or 4 turning forms in here, make the edges correct and the values nice, and have it read as the whole big form and all this stuff, it's probably just not worth it. The area is just so small and it's not really our focal point, so we don't really want to, you know, spend all our efforts there in terms of the time on this picture. Same applies to the feet. You can see I left a lot of like the smaller stuff out. Always ask yourself, you know, what am I trying to learn here? So are you trying to learn to, you know, address super small details, anatomy of hands, anatomy of feet, you know? If that's your learning goal, then you should just be drawing hands or feet. But we're trying to, you know, get the whole figure here. Of course, if you want to super accurately represent this figure, then you probably just need to work larger. And that's fine, you know, you can do that. Even for this project, you can double the size basically. Then you will have all the space you need probably to work on those very small details. I think it's just a bit more time consuming with graphite. I think the most time consuming part is probably just filling in the tone. Very dark. Just takes, you know, a couple hours even if you work this size, as opposed to something like this. The longest plumb line we used for the graphite figures was 30 centimeters, probably exactly because of that. Just takes so long to refine. But then again, when you know, enlarge the figure, then you don't have to work this pickily, you know, with the grain of the paper basically. At that point you can then just sort of ignore that. The grain is so small that it doesn't really distract the bigger transitions and smaller transitions. When we're working this size, we definitely have to do a little bit of that dot picking to just manage to convey everything nicely. I'm just taking a final peek at the drawing here. Just looking to, you know, refine anything that sort of stands out as not reading very well. Where the form is a bit lacking, I'll just dot pick this edge a little bit. Yeah, I don't really love the outline I've got going all over the figure, but I think, you know, this, I mean, I see a lot of, you know, small problems probably would fix if this was just a personal project. But, you know, I think this is very much sufficient for the demonstration. And finally, let's wrap up the rendering of the lights and then move to the rendering of the darks. All right, let's finish up this project. So let's start rendering the darks. Again, using the HB mostly for this stage. I think I'll just start off picking the low-hanging fruit, meaning cleaning up the shadows here on the lower limbs, because these are, you know, pretty simple. There's nothing crazy happening here, let's say. And again, I'm mostly looking to work the shadows in this case by just perhaps reinforcing some of the darkest bits, but mainly I'll just be cleaning these up in terms of like evening the value. If I have some reflected lights going, I just want to, you know, make sure the shape is right, soften things like this. So I'm not really looking to, you know, make huge changes in terms of the bedbug line, because that would result in me having to re-render the transition of the bedbug line. And sometimes, you know, rendering the transition means you have to render some of the halftones that follow the transition, and it can, you know, if you really go out of control there, you might just have to re-render most of the area that's, you know, facing that bedbug line. So we don't want to do that. That's just, you know, that's silly. Of course, as I'm going, you know, any of the darks, be it dark halftones or shadows, I'm just going to touch up if I see some, you know, light spots, for example, that are distracting the bigger picture. Again, this is pretty subtle stuff I'm doing, but once you pick out all the lighter spots in an area like this shadow, for example, it starts to look really soft and atmospheric all of a sudden, which is nice. We want that. And again, this dot picking stuff is equally about picking black dots as it is, you know, coloring the lighter things in. So usually once you do one step, you'll start noticing the other ones. In this case, I first colored in those lighter marks, and then I was left with some darker marks, which I then picked off, and then the result is that we have something that looks nicer. Here I'm touching the bedbug line and the transition, so I'm just trying to be really careful. Some darker marks sort of distracting us a little bit there. I'm just slightly touching up the shadow side of the bedbug line to soften it a little bit. It was looking a little bit linear for my taste. Yeah, as you probably gathered so far, we don't really enjoy having lines when we want to, you know, communicate in forms in this realistic rendering thing. Rendering. I'm tripping over words here. Yeah, looking at the reference image, I feel pretty comfortable just pretty much first darkening this whole area by coloring in all the lighter marks, just make it smooth and nice, and then reassess, you know, do we have to lighten something up first. Yeah, when working an area like this, it's always important to first assess, you know, do you want to make it lighter or darker, or perhaps is it the perfect value right now? Because then you'll know, you know, if you want to go darker, obviously you want to start by coloring in things with the pencil rather than picking things out. And likewise, you know, if you find it's the perfect value but you still go in and pick stuff out, then you need to put something in as well to maintain the same value. And again, after darkening some things, the darker spots start appearing next to those, since I now made a smooth tone, admittedly darker than the initial tone, but once I smooth that tone out, then what we have left is some even darker spots. And yeah, we just have to remember what the goal here is, you know. The goal isn't really to be faithful to the photo, but it's rather, you know, find something that works for the image we've already made. So the main goal here is to, you know, get this shadow nice and clean. Try to reduce any sort of distractions. Also, I'm not interested in finding the edge of this thigh because it doesn't really add anything to the image. It feels nice to lose some edges here and there. I'm just looking to create a very subtle sort of reflected light in here. Just maybe in order to, you know, have a little bit of variety as well in that shadow. So it's not just a, you know, flat shape of the same value over here. You can also perhaps look for some slightly darker areas in the shadow, since this knee, for example, seems to be pretty dark. It's pretty vertical, so it's not really catching a lot of reflected light. Just want to soften it quite a bit. Areas like this need to be subdued. A pretty good rule of thumb when working like this is if you find something that feels a bit distracting, it's probably that something is a bit too sharp, sort of pops out. Maybe it's that there's a single, black dot that is sort of creating a weirdness in the, bedbug line or something else, but you can always, assess what's causing the issue and then address it. Like here in the bedbug line, there's a dot that's a bit out of place, it sort of feels like it's popping right off the line, so let's just pick that out and the whole transition should feel a little bit more clean. And there's more subtle things happening here as well. But yeah, we don't want to get too picky with the dot picking because it is a pretty much an endless endeavor if you just start being super picky with it. I do recommend you push a little bit, beyond your comfort zone in terms of the level of finish you're aiming for. Make it a little bit nicer than you feel comfortable. Put yourself to work, really. That's something that really will reward you in the end. But yeah, just keep the goal in mind. What's your goal? Like overall goal, I mean, and then set the goal for the project accordingly. That said, if your goal is to just get to painting as quickly as possible, then perhaps I recommend just, push yourself a little bit with this drawing stuff and it will reward you later on. So. Yeah, shadows like this don't really need to be rendered to be specific because they sort of had to be already addressed during the rendering of the lights, but if we feel that things aren't maybe quite the correct value, then of course we need to do something about it and perhaps just touch the halftones a little bit. Doesn't take too long and it's worth it for sure. Okay, we started heading up, but we didn't really tackle this foot too much yet, but we did just work on the shadows a little bit on this foot during the rendering of the lights. I mean, there's this overall area here. It's like a blend between halftones and shadows, so. Yeah, here I'm just touching the transition a little bit too much, which results in me having to sort of tackle this area a little bit again. Not ideal, but perhaps we can push the value here a little bit. It's falling into shadow over there, so again we want to do it kind of gradually so we don't mess up all the transitions we already gave it once over, but let's just leave it at that. The darkness gives a little bit more depth to that, and we could always push these things very dark as well. That always gives us a bit of range to turn the form, but yeah, they can be a bit distracting too. So I think I'm just leaving them as they are here. Then the area that we haven't really touched yet so much would be the face. For that I'll just hone my pencil real quick and then let's look at that. Again, let's start with cleaning up the area. In this stage we want to mostly darken things rather than lighten things. So I'm just starting the process from the sides where the modeling is happening. Basically just coloring in any of these lighter spotchy marks. They sort of serve to destroy the form a little bit. Also in the face it kind of looks like pock marks or something, so it's not really a place where you want to leave these very patchy areas. You know, comparing the face to the hair, we want to get a different texture, of course. The hair, I'm probably not even going to touch it too much because, you know, I like the fuzzy kind of texture I've got going there. It's not necessarily, you know, extremely hair-like in terms of texture, but the difference already makes it feel like a different material. And it all kind of works in favor of the whole image. Alright, I think we arrived at a somewhat smooth finish, and then I think we want to pick out a little bit more light in the center here. Again, just picking out the darker stuff so we can be left with something a little bit lighter, but I'm trying to avoid, you know, lightening it by a lot. So remember, we initially kind of identified this area as a halftone, but it was so dark that didn't really make sense to me to sort of group it with the lights. Just a sort of efficiency decision, I guess. Could work either way, but I just felt like it's more simple to group this area as part of the darks. I think it's already, in terms of value, looking pretty good, but we probably have to clean this up a little bit more. So it's a bit more even. I'm just cleaning a little bit of this fuzziness around that's not really looking like, you know, hair texture or something along those lines. So yeah, moving on to the hair, I don't really want to smooth this area out. We don't have, you know, smooth cylinders or tubes of hair. It's doing its own thing. It's a very sort of organic thing that's happening over here in the hair. So we can address it like that. Here perhaps there's a little bit more texture where the ends are gathering. So I'll just try to find that sort of darker shape of hair that is leaving over here. So perhaps this area will find some of these lighter spots and try to darken these a little bit so we don't have any lighter things popping up too much in this area. Since the texture is a little bit different and it's a darker area because I don't know, maybe the ends just clump here a little bit different than the shiny hair. I guess it's perhaps the fact that the ends aren't reflecting as much, so they don't have those highlighty parts to them. So just darkening this area overall a little bit by working in these lighter spots. And perhaps we can pull some, you know, pull some hair back into that area so it doesn't look too, you know, outlined. And I think if we have stuff that is, you know, just too light for the area, we can color some of those in, but we're not looking to even out the texture, just bring those back a little bit towards the darker side of things so they don't really pop out of there so much. They can remain as squigglies, but we don't want them as white squigglies, we want them as dark gray squigglies. very scientific, this. Alright, I think that's already looking a little bit better. Perhaps here on the hair I think we need to darken quite a bit, so let's just push the value a little bit more, create a bit of dimension, depth to this area as well. It's feeling a little bit on the flat side. We don't have to carry it out as a line going there, we can just darken things in this sort of path, let's say, and things will start appearing as if they connect, you know. And here things are looking a little bit on the lighter side, so I'm just coloring in those lighter marks again. I think here on the main light area in the hair, the sort of highlight area, there's quite a few of these darker dots that we could pick out. And yeah, it's not maybe texture that we sort of feel reads as hair texture, so we want to get rid of that. See this highlight going on the back of the head against the white. It's obviously going to be very dark still, but we can use that to further soften the hair a little bit. Just get rid of the very darkest outline. Try to get some edge variety over here. This edge is looking a little bit too crisp, so let's just can leave a little bit of, you know, the unevenness of the articulation over there. We don't really mind having stuff like that happening. Sort of can read a little bit like hairs popping out here and there. But yeah, the main thing with the hair is we don't want sharp edges unless they're very, you know, controlled. So maybe we can leave a little bit of a sharper edge here where the bangs seem to create, you know, a sharper shape. But even there we can add a bit of variety, so it's not just sharp all over. Perhaps we can soften it a little bit, though. Don't have to have it extremely sharp. Speaking of that area, perhaps we can find the light shape again, so we have something to look at over here. Actually, kind of the very tip of this light shape extends to the top almost here, so just find that stuff. This area was toned super dark, so the tone is lifting kind of unevenly, so you get very light marks where it's lifting off and leaves very dark squiggly marks. Areas like this we could even use the stump to sort of erase some of those darker bits without going extremely light instead of the kneaded eraser. As you can see, it leaves a lighter tone. You could even try it here, you know, in the hair. Maybe this is already too light where it doesn't really gather, you know, graphite and lift it off, but definitely in these very dark areas it will do that. And we do want it to turn to dark here as well. Here I'm just trying to smooth out the texture in these very dark hair areas. We don't really see that texture happening if we have a very dark, shadowy area of hair. So maybe then we need to clean up this transition area as well a little bit. Just color in these lightest moments. Let's do one more short session after this. All right, final session for this project, I think. And before we head back into the hair area, I think I just wanna pull out some darkness from here. I was looking from further away, which always helps, and felt like this was just a little bit too much in the middle of the form there, just not working. Yeah, these are subtle things. They're just perhaps you need to look at them from further away, so you're just focus on the big stuff, value relationships rather than the small rendering details like we're working on at this stage. Can't help but nudge a few things while we're in this area, so just do that while we're here, and then I believe we can head back to the hair and just finish that off, and that's probably gonna be it for this project. Back to the HB pencil. I think we want to keep pushing the darker area a little bit more towards here, since that's what we're seeing. This is still, the darker part of the big form modeling over here where I'm working. So let's darken it a little bit more. Giving some of these highlight shapes a little bit more form here. So, if there's a dark line going across the hair like this, obviously it's gonna start somewhere and it's gonna turn darker towards the curve, so might as well give it a bit of turning tone to give a bit of more, three-dimensional variation to these hair shapes as well. I don't think we need too much more than this, but perhaps we can reinforce some of those highlight areas a little bit. First, let's bring this area down though. I feel like this is too light overall. And then we can, pull some of those highlight shapes back in if we want. And this is why maybe the hard eraser is better. This kneaded eraser sometimes just overdoes it so much. So perhaps let's work with this. I think this is feeling a bit off, this tone right here. Perhaps it's too dark in the lighter area of the form, and also it sort of connects to the adjacent area over here where there's, I don't know, it doesn't really make sense. So we worked it a little bit and it's better now. Yeah. So perhaps this area is looking a little better, so let's maybe pick out some of these darker dots over here as well. I find them a bit distracting. Can always put some of those darks in, but here the distracting bit is the dots, definitely. It's not lighter squigglies. And I'm looking also to maybe lighten things a little bit, even if I want to leave a line sort of quality in these shapes or texture we're leaving here. I'm still trying to lighten those slightly, as we don't really want them to be super dark in the lighter part of the form. And yeah, I think we're getting closer to the finish line here. Maybe we can just break this this clump of hair down a little bit more, just give it a couple, couple of these strandy feeling areas. We don't just wanna overdo it, maybe just give it a little bit of that hair-like texture. Again, when we work these lines, we want to avoid having sharp linear shapes. And I think again we need to pick out some of those distractions. Yeah, we don't mind a bit of texture, but I don't want a dark single round spot in the middle of my light shape. Sort of not really serving anything. Whereas here we have some kind of linear texture, even though it's kind of hatchy in the way it works. I don't really feel like it's too far from the hair texture. Maybe we could, reduce it a little bit in places. Break these lines apart a little bit more. Let's say soften the texture. We don't necessarily want to get rid of everything here, but okay, I think this is, plenty good for a demonstration of this type. Let's leave it here. I hope one human being, a single one out there, watches this whole demo and perhaps benefits from it. Thank you. I will see you guys in the next phase of this program. That will be charcoal.